Hello, this is Cho of the Shiny Colors Discord. Welcome to another episode of The Shiny Review. Today we've got 3 new Produce SSRs to talk about. We have the My Songs Collection banner, which features both Natsuha as well as Mei. And then we have the new permanent SSR banner featuring Hinana. Keep in mind, of course, that My Songs Collection is limited, technically. Anytime a My Songs Collection banner happens, these cards will return, but the likelihood of those banners coming back is usually about every couple of months or so. And of course, their rates will be drastically lowered by being a returning card rather than the featured card. And then Hinana is permanent, with the only real difference is that if you pull on the banner, you get a guaranteed 2-star copy of her if you find her. We're going to start with My Songs Collection first, because they are the older of the two. We'll start with Natsuha. So, Natsuha is a pure dance unit, so automatically we have to consider how good she's going to be compared to Natsuha 7, who is kind of the whole point of Dance Hokura. And so her being in contention for that spot means that there's some pretty big shoes to fill. Her initial appeal is a Dance 3.5 appeal that duets randomly with Hokura, and the upgraded version is a Dance 5.0 that also duets with Hokura. They both have a change appeal, meaning that you can discard them in order to gain an effect. The change requirement is you have to be playing the full Hokura lineup, and the effect is a Dance 20% buff for 3 turns. This is true between both appeals. For her passives, her 2-star passive is a Dance 85% up, as well as Memory Gauge 15% up if you're in the center position, and it has a 30% chance to activate once. Her 4-star passive is a Dance 120% up if you have 4 or more Hokura members in your skill history, which has a 30% chance to activate twice. Her memory appeal when maxed out is a Dance maximum 3.5 appeal that scales based on how many cards are in your skill history, that links into a Dance 3.0. Natsuha is okay. Really, the biggest thing that stops her from being bad is that her memory appeal is at least a Dance 6.5 when completely maxed out. The problem with this is that everything else about her kit is kind of bad. The fact that she has a Dance 3.5 and a Dance 5.0 as her main appeals kind of is unfortunate because you have support cards that already do better than this. I can think of many of the Hokura cards that not only grant duet, but also grant you either a buff or maybe attention up, which are all things that Dance Hokura can really appreciate. I also think that the change appeal effect being Dance 20% up does not really do a whole lot for her either. While it is true that Dance Hokura do not have a ton of active dance buffs floating around, 20% and 20% are not going to really add up to a ton of damage in the grand scheme of things when you consider the kind of passives they're throwing around. I think that in order to have made this change appeal really effective and make this Natsuha a really interesting piece that enables cards that have not had a great opportunity to be useful, would be to change the change appeal to be attention up for 3 turns. So maybe if it's attention 25% up for 3 turns, or maybe 30% for 3 turns, something that at least enables those supports like Christmas Jury, who have had trouble being effective in the past because Hokura not being able to use attention up appeals means that they can't activate that relatively good passive. So that's kind of my whole take on this card. I think this card is very pretty. Like, if you're somebody that's just here for the aesthetic, Natsuha's card is very good. I think this card is super gorgeous and absolutely worth it for the collection alone. Functionally, I think Natsuha 7 is still the much better bet, and really the only reason why you would consider this card for functionality right now is if you don't have Natsuha 7 and want to play a kind of weird Dance Hokura that don't particularly have a great cannon unit in the dance position, that is, and just focus on making her memory appeal as strong as possible by spamming duet cards with any sort of frequency in order to get herself set up as fast as possible. So I'm going to give her a B+ as a unit, and then maybe an S as a center. I think that's really the biggest thing, is that her being an actually solid enough center helps stopping her for being just like B overall or worse. So now we have Mei. Mei is a pure vocal unit. Her initial appeal is a vocal 3.5 that fortifies vocal buffs. So remember what this means is that if you have a buff already, so we take, for example, this buff gives her a 10% vocal buff for 3 turns and a vocal 5% buff for 5 turns. If we already had those, then until the buff goes away on its own, those buffs are treated as double their effectiveness after you use the appeal. So any buffs that you get on the same turn do not get affected by this, but buffs that you get after the fact will be affected, or rather, buffs that you already have had active will be the ones boosted. And so you can only fortify buffs you already have if you use another vocal fortifying appeal. The upgraded version of this appeal is a vocal 5.0 that fortifies vocal buffs, that grants a 20% vocal buff for 3 turns and a 10% vocal buff for 5 turns. Both of these have a plus appeal, which requires you to be in the center position, which is a vocal 25% up for 5 turns on the initial appeal, or vocal 50% up for 5 turns on the 4-star appeal. Now for her passives, her 2-star passive is a vocal 70% up and memory gauge 15% up if you have 1 or more active vocal up buffs, which has a 20% chance to activate twice. The 4-star passive is a vocal 130% up if you have 5 or more vocal up buffs, 20% chance to activate twice. Her memory appeal, when maxed out, is a vocal 50% buff for 5 turns that links into a vocal 4 that fortifies your vocal buffs. I think Mei is kind of bad. While the premise of doubling up on your buffs is fine, we've seen other cards that have made use of this in the past, the problem is that her buffs, even after doubling, aren't very good in that vacuum, and so you would need to have some really strong sets of vocal buffs in order to really make the most of this boost. And the problem is that most of what you're doing does not make use of this buff. The plus appeals also shoe her into being used at the cost of slowing down vocal stray light, which can be kind of a problem. Because you're ideally wanting to get that 50% vocal buff before you go off on your memory appeal, it means you're stopping at turn 3 as opposed to going off on turn 3. And if Fest goes any faster, because you'll have Fests where the judges are made of paper, stopping an extra turn is not very ideal, which automatically makes this rotation much worse in comparison. The memory appeal also does not really feel like much of a finisher by being a buff into a small appeal that just fortifies your vocal buffs. It feels like what they want you to do is then follow it up with another vocal AoE, but I feel like realistically you should almost always be aiming for your memory appeal to be the ender if you can make that happen. And it's strange because in the past, My Songs Collection are usually the de facto centers, while I don't really feel like that's the case with this Mei. There's certainly an idea here, but it feels like it's executed somewhat poorly, and I can't imagine that this card is going to be too particularly popular unless somebody finds some very specific way to break this card, or at least break Vocal Stray Light in a way that it is not already playing as it is now. There'd be a lot of shifting to make this card feel particularly good. I'm going to give this card a B as a unit and a B+ as a center. So, now we have Hinana. So Hinana, being a Pern, means that she has dual stat. She starts out as a visual card and upgrades into a vocal card starting at 3 stars. Her initial appeal is a visual 3.0 that grants 20% evasion for 4 turns. The upgraded version is a vocal 4.5 that grants 30% evasion for 4 turns. For the link appeals, the visual appeal has a link alongside Koito and Toru, which grants you 1 mulligan. And the vocal appeal just requires Madoka for 1 mulligan. For her passives, the first is a vocal visual 50% up and evasion 40% up at 2 stars, which requires it to be turn 3 or later, and it has a 20% chance to activate twice. The 4-star passive is a vocal 85% up if you're in the full Nocchill lineup, so Koito, Hinana, Madoka, and Toru all on the stage at once, 20% chance to activate once. Her memory appeal, when maxed out, is a vocal 2.0 that scales based on how many active reaction buffs you have, that links into a vocal 3.0 that scales based on how many reaction buffs you have. Hinana is, unfortunately, pretty bad. Her passives are not very strong, which is understandable for a permanent SSR. Vocal visual 50% up is kind of a weird split, and I get that the point is that they dropped those numbers because there's a 40% evasion stacked onto it. Problem is, while that's nice and all, there's not really a huge payoff for doing so. Like, this card is built to just try to stack up attention as much as possible, but the problem is that because most of her buffs are relatively short, like, these are okay at 4 turns, but you would need to have more instances of that in order to try to get your 4 or more active reaction buffs in order to max out your memory appeal. And even then, I don't think that the memory appeal is that strong, even when maxed out. 5.0 is fine for this team, but I feel like it's going to be very gimmicky and hard to really make use of unless you absolutely build around this Hinana, which doesn't feel particularly worth it. I'm going to give this card a C+ as a unit, and a C- to maybe an A- as a center. Not to say that a 5.0 is absolutely the worst thing you could be doing, but I think the combination of it being kind of hard to use outside of very specialized teams, combined with it not being a super huge payoff for being as difficult as it is, will drop some points on it at the very least, which is why you have a pretty low baseline, but it has a reasonably high ceiling if you're able to really make the most of this kind of card, if that's something you're interested in doing. So, that will do it for the video today. Thank you, as always, for watching. Next time we'll be talking about whatever banner comes next. Also, at the time of this recording, we are just a few hours away from the 5.5 anniversary live performance, where I'm sure we're going to be getting plenty of news and crazy things happening. It seems like we may be expecting a certain trio to make their proper debut in Shiny. Maybe. But we'll just have to find out in the next couple of days. Let's look forward to it together. Till the next video, I've been Cho. Once again, thank you for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day.